Oh, okay. I'm happy to moderate. Well, welcome. This is the panel on world building. A collection of authors and game designers discuss how they went about creating the worlds of their science fiction and fantasy. What I usually do is we will allow everybody to introduce themselves. We will start with some comments. I usually allow the panel to speak for about the first half hour or so, and then throw it open to discussion or comments or questions from the audience. But what I'm going to suggest is, because we have this wonderful chat function, feel free to comment or ask questions at any time. We may not get to them until the second half of the panel, but at least they'll be there for us when you're inspired to have your input. I'm just going to go across the screen as I see it. So let's start. Arlene, if you could just briefly introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you, Ira. Okay, I'm Arlene F. Marks. I write space opera. I write in the entire speculative fiction genre, because I've written stories that fall under the headings of horror, fantasy, dark fantasy, urban fantasy, space opera, and hard science fiction. So I'm completely immersed in the genre. And I'm Canadian. I live and write in Collingwood, Ontario, which is on the water. It's on the southern shore of Georgian Bay, a lovely area to live in. And every time I write a story, basically I'm creating a world. So this is a great panel, and I'm going to enjoy very much being on it. Thank you. Ira, you're muted.
And of course I'm muted. Stephen, give us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm Stephen B. Pearl. B makes it easy to find me on the internet. I write like Arlene, I write across the spec fic genre. So I do a lot of world building. Currently, my biggest project is the Freedom Saga, which is not just world building, it's galaxy building. And so lots of worlds in there. But also I world extrapolation for the Tinker's World series, which is about 200 years in our future. So I have a lot of experience with world building and trying to make something that's cohesive and holds together. And a lot of my work is with Brain Lag, who are actually at the con this year. So
no problem. Grady, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Grady. I live in Denver, Colorado, where I teach English. And I'm a debut novelist. My first book is coming out in September. It's called Allium, and it's a high fantasy science fiction epic. My whole motivation in this book initially was world building and making it really convincing, totally like original universe with a mythology and cosmology and all these stories that you don't even really see in the text, that might just be sort of partially there. And I think my inspiration for that was largely Tolkien, and it was a really fun experience doing all this, and I'm happy to talk about it.
Okay. And JD.
Hi, I'm JD DeLuzio. I'm following up from Grady. I was in Denver once, and we've flown in from where I am now, which is the Great Lakes Basin, though I'm a few hours away from Arlene. As I've been saying at other panels, if you got a map out and drew a line from Detroit to Toronto and stuck a pin halfway through, I'd probably say, ouch. But one of the most amusing things is when we arrived in Denver, there had just been a storm, I guess, that morning. And when we walked into the hotel, somebody apologized for, they said, it's not usually this humid. And we thought, we just came in from the Great Lakes Basin. If it ever got that dry, we would be concerned about the drought. Um, so world building is very much about paying attention to those things. And to pick up on something that Arlene said, whether you're doing science fiction or fantasy or horror or, you know, conventional realistic fiction, and I've done all of those mostly in short stories. And there's a little bit of all of them in this book, Live Nude Aliens, although the realistic stories are brushing up against genre. There's a ghost story and there's a slipstream story. You're always world building, whether you're doing a completely fantastic world or, you know, you're building a world from the ground up, or whether you're setting it in the real world. Honestly, I've spent often more time researching real historical settings than I have spent in creating completely original worlds. And I've often found it more daunting to write about real life human beings whose experience in the world is a little different than mine, than to create aliens where nobody can come out and say, hey, you screwed that up. Shut up, that's just what they're like, that alien race. So it's always world building, and it's such an important part of writing.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Ira Nayman. My 8th novel was just published by Elsewhere Press. I've had a couple of dozen short stories published, and I write primarily comedy, write humor, but most of my narrative fiction has been combining it with various subgenres of speculative fiction. And JD actually touched on a subject that I wanted to start with, and this is that idea that some people have that world building is specific to genre fiction. And there is a slight amount of truth to that idea, because on the one hand, if you're telling a realistic story set in the real world, quote unquote, you don't have to explain the existence of, say, cars, right? We all pretty much know what cars are, and we know how they work roughly. You know, you put your foot on the gas pedal and they run. Whereas, you know, you do have to describe the reality of, say, spaceships, because they're not part of our reality, and so they need. And so there is this idea that we need to actually do more world building in genre fiction than we do in literary fiction, which I think is a classic misimpression. I think that's fundamentally wrong. Take the example I gave of cars. Now, I'm from Toronto. I live in Toronto, and the cars that you see driven downtown, the BMWs and Mercedes, because it's a wealthy area downtown, are very different from the cars you see in the suburbs where I live, which tend to be more family sedans and more practical cars, which are very different from cars that are, say, driven in Eastern Europe, where they tend to be of the boxy Russian design, which are very different from the cars that are driven in Cuba, which tends to have a lot of actually American cars from the 1950s. All of these could be parts of the worlds of realistic fiction, right, of literary fiction. But if you wanted to create a real world in any of those locations, you would still have to build it with the kind of details that we have to do in genre fiction. So all fiction has to do world building. So I'm agreeing with JD and thanking him for bringing up that point. So the question then becomes, how do you go about creating the fictional worlds? What details do you look for? What details do you not include? And I'll start again with Arlene. Just how do you go about creating a realistic world or an immersive world in your fiction?
Okay. I'm a Bible maker. I'm one of those people who decides ahead of time, okay, here's what the transportation is like, here's what government is like, here's the educational system, here's how they dispose of waste, and so on. And I actually create a document that outlines all those details before I start. So I know, I do it because I'm lazy. I know that sounds backwards. I do a lot of work up front because if I don't, I'm going to have to do even more work as I go along, making corrections in the manuscript, making alterations, based on what the characters decide they want to do or where they want to go. There are parts of the world that my characters are going to explore and take me along with them, and I'm going to learn about those as I go along. But there are these fundamental basic things about the environment that I have to establish beforehand. And one of them is the history of that environment. So I actually wrote a future history of Earth for Sic Transit Terra. I wrote a future history of Earth, and I wrote what life is like on Earth at the turn of the 25th century. And I included those in my Bible.
Now, of course, like research, most of that Bible is not going to appear directly in the novel, correct?
No, that's right. It's for my benefit so that I don't mess up and put in anachronisms or I get the timing screwed up or something. It's just to keep me straight on what's happening when and where and how.
Mm-hmm. Stephen, how do you go about creating your worlds?
Well, Arlene and I are a lot alike because my writing style is predicated upon doing a real thorough build on my world to start with and dropping my characters into it and role-playing with myself. But a lot of the time what I'll do, again, that's just referencing my science fiction worlds, I'll start with the life form that I want to be my primary life form, and I'll back engineer from that. I'll look at what kind of environment would have resulted in a body plan like my life form has. What kind of technology does my life form have? And how does that technology interact with other life forms? So with the calentrozoids, for example, they look like giant jellyfish with a ring of blinking lights along the base of their bell. They communicate through a form of semaphore, and their dangling tentacles are actually manipulative digits. And to have them, basically they're from a gas giant. So I also looked at gas giants, and from that, actually an interesting thing that came from that is the line, "May you languish in the region of freezing oxygen," because gas giants get these pockets of apparently oxygen and other gases segregated in their system. And in effect, if a calentrozoid tells you that, he's telling you to go to hell.
Okay, just to be clear for the audience, which series of your novels do they appear in?
They appear in the Freedom Saga, Cloning Freedom, Freedom's Law, as of December, Freedom's Myth, and as of December after that, Arming Freedom.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Grady, I got you with your mouth full of liquid, but it's your turn. How did you go about creating the world of your first novel?
Well, I think that you can add as much detail as you want and invent as many concepts as you want, but if there's no passion or depth to those details, it can come off as a little meaningless, perhaps sometimes, to have like this massive world that's just populated with all these ideas. And I think that sometimes you can tell when a writer doesn't necessarily care about these details that are being added. And so for me, I think there really is a reason for everything that you put in the book. It can't just be like, oh, and there's this ridiculous type of mushroom over here, which there are many in my book, but they serve a mythological purpose. And so rather than walking around this like amusement park of amazing ideas, I think that the world has to have a cosmology. And so for me, that also, like you were saying, Bible making involves writing some scripture, a lot of just kind of like wiki format building type things, but also just literally writing the Bible of the world and how it came to be and the different peoples that arose and the structure of how it works. And for me, whenever my characters are walking around or things are happening, I want there to be an ability for the reader to say, like, this house over here, or this tavern, or this mountain, like, what is the story behind that thing? And I want that story to exist, even if it doesn't show up in the book. So, and, sometimes they do a little bit. But secondly, I think one of the most important things about immersion is having restraint, just being able to have all these ideas and not just instantly share everything. So I think the ability to just hold back and retain that secretive nature that the real world has when you're going on an adventure, instead of just hammering the reader with all kinds of amazing ideas, although that's fun. But I think that what I respect about, books like The Lord of the Rings, which is a huge influence for me, and the Bible itself, really, are that, the author will spend as much time and care working on a flower beside the road as they will on some epic battle. To me, that's what immersion is. So.
Okay. JD, anything you'd like to add about your own process?
I like, I think I've reinforced what a lot of people have said. You need to know the world, but you don't need to tell people. You have to know what parts of that world should be shared, and which parts are really interesting. Them, but they don't have any relevance to your story. And if people wanted to read a description of the world, I don't know what they'd look at, but they probably wouldn't look at a novel or a short story. I like China Mayville does this incredibly well in the Buzzlug novels. I think I did it passably well in the short story Let There Be, where you just walk through the world like it's the world. Mm-hmm. Even if it's completely original, and things are described where necessary, shorthanded where not necessary, and the writer knows the stuff so that there's at least not inconsistencies, or things that, because the reader will sense inconsistencies or things that don't add up. I've always thought it was interesting. Richard Linklater, the director-writer in Dazed and Confused, the actors, there was a plan for what every character was doing for that entire movie, even when they weren't on camera. And the actors had to know it. So when they showed up in scene such and such, after having chronologically last been in the movie, 4 hours earlier in the day, they knew where they were coming from and what they did. And that mattered. That's not knowledge the reader has, or the viewer in that case has, but it actually matters. And I know that there's a lot of ways to do that. I know I created an imaginary Port Huron town that shows up in a number of stories and in the novel The Con, called Rose Point, where I've written a quasi-history of some of the important points of that town. Just in case they come up, I have something to reference. They usually don't, but it's there. And in another story that was published and is republished in Love Nude Aliens, set in a small town, it's a Lovecraftian parody. I actually went to a nearby small town and mapped the town that they were in off that town. I was free to change details if I wanted, just because I wanted it to have the feel of a real location. That this is someplace that you might actually be. And I grabbed details. Oh, I never would have thought of that detail. So I'm going to if I could mention that detail, because it makes it feel like a real place. It's that sense of being consistent with the reality you've created, whether it's a completely fantastic world you've created, or whether it's, you know, a town down the road where your story takes place, or a blend of both. You know, unless you're Alice going through Wonderland, where everything changes because nature of her dream Wonderland. And even there's an awful lot of things that consistently come back. You have to, your world has to make sense to you. I've got a story about that, but I'll perhaps drop it later.
Okay. Okay. So, I mean, one of the things that I'm hearing a lot in what people are saying is that the world building should not interfere with the storytelling.
Mhm.
That story is still sort of the main sort of thing that we're trying to do. So I guess my question then would be, how do you decide which details to use and when to put them in the narrative, right? And, you know, I'll preface this with the obvious. There are some writers, particularly hard science fiction writers, but not entirely hard science fiction writers, who do what we call info dumping. They just go on for several pages about the technology in their world to make sure it works, to make sure that the reader understands how the technology works. There is a story I heard about a very famous hard science fiction writer, actually, who was asked, well, why do you go on at such length describing technologies? And his answer was, well, because my readers want it. So there are actually people who want the info dumping. They want the world building. But I assume for a more general readership, that is not the case. So how do you go about deciding which details to keep and which details not to keep? And I'll start at the opposite end with Grady this time. What was your experience deciding these things?
Deciding what details to include.
Yeah.
I think that mostly it comes down to characterization and that what a character is going to do or experience or perceive. Because then a detail serves a purpose. It might not serve a purpose in the overarching narrative, but it does tell us about the character and what is salient to them in the world. A lot of times I write from this kind of over-the-shoulder third person that stays very close to the character's perspectives. And I try not to like zoom out too much so that their eyes show us the details of the world. And they might be more interested in animals or plants or rocks or the heavens or religion or you know, their personal journey throughout the story. And that gives me a lot of opportunities to show more about the world without doing it sort of arbitrarily. Just sort of maybe info dumping or doing some big pan and describing a visual, which I love to do. So I want to be able to do that through a character. And I think there are several visuals too that you can look at through the eyes of different characters, and you can see how their different cultures and backgrounds create this more dynamic picture of artifacts in the world. You know, for instance, my story kind of centers around this large mountain, and all of the characters sort of see it as a different symbol in their life, and that tells us more not only about the history of the physical mountain, but also about the places that they come from and the places that they want to go and who they're becoming. It's definitely hard not to info dump when you have so much you want to share, and I think that comes back to the restraint idea that I was talking about. And also a big thing in that is trusting your reader. You know, if you go on for several pages explaining how a technology works, at some point maybe you're talking down to your reader a little bit and sort of holding their hand in the story and not letting them experience the world for themselves. I personally love to read a book that makes me wonder about how these things work, and I only want to know just enough to where there is that mystery of, you know, where does this come from and how does it function? And but that's very hard to do. And I think with my students in English, I'm constantly having to tell them, like, look, they understand. You don't need to, you don't need to say this so many times in so many different words. Have faith in who's reading your essay, and maybe some people won't get what you're saying, but it'll be better if you trust them. So,
Stephen, what do you think?
Well, I think you drop in what you need for the story, when you need it for the story, and you say it well. An example being, in my Freedom Saga, people have gravity lasers and anti-gravity. So we've learned how to manipulate gravity. Then I come to the point where the ship is launching. And I just say, they lower the gravity so that the specific gravity is such that it floats like a blimp up into the air. And as such, I've stated, yes, they can manipulate gravity. I've given the mechanics for how they get off the ground and get this really large thing. It's as big as an oil tanker ship off the ground. But I've done it in one line. And anybody who understands what specific gravity is going, or how a blimp works. And most people understand how a blimp works, or a hot air balloon. They're going to get it. So it's a matter of super simplifying and also realizing what is pertinent. I don't have to go into every nitty gritty detail. I need to know them, but my audience only if it becomes appropriate to the story.
Okay. I'm not sure I would say it's oversimplifying. I think what we have to keep in mind as writers is that while we are creating worlds, we are limited by the word count we have and the amount of language we can actually use. So we can't actually create a fully three-dimensional world as we in real life experience it. And every writer has to find what I think of as the telling detail, that one line that will explain that technology. But here's the thing. If you are seeding your story with telling details, you can actually suggest to the reader a much more full world than if you spend 5 pages actually describing a specific thing. Right? It's the accumulation of those small details that actually make a world kind of come to life for somebody who's reading. But that's just my opinion. JD, how do you decide what world building details go in and what don't?
Depends on the genre and the kind of story you're writing, very much. By the way, the other problem with the 5 pages of info dump, although I know hard science fiction readers are partially looking for that, is the opportunity to say things that sound stupid next year increases exponentially when you try and explain sophisticated technology. I teach an English course for science students, and a few years ago, a student wrote a paper based on Robert Charles Wilson's novel Spin, which I recommend. It's a great book. And wanted to do a paper coming up with a plausible explanation for how the spin membrane, which is a piece of alien super tech, might plausibly work within the rules of physics as we know them. Obviously, it involves a lot of, you would need something that can do this, even if this is not something that we would have any clue how to do now. I was so impressed by the paper, I sent it to Robert Charles Wilson, who emailed back and not only complimented the student, said, this student thought a whole lot more about the spin membrane than I ever did. He said, I just created something that was a piece of alien tech that's functioned in a consistent way and sprinkled some, I think he said, I sprinkled some fairy dust on it because the implication is the aliens are so advanced, we couldn't possibly explain how they're doing what they're doing with the spin membrane. But he was, on the other hand, consistent about it. And I think you have to be. But a lot of it depends on the genre. Are you writing fantasy where magic is real? That gives you a bit of latitude, as long as your magic is consistent, versus a science fiction story where things have to be grounded in credible science. You know, and that's a very different thing. And so if you want the poles, it's the extreme between what can happen in the real world versus, you know, nerds online or at a room in a convention, and I'd be one of them, trying to explain how Superman flies. Shut up, he flies, okay? There is no signal, there's no possible scientific explanation for that. It's fantasy. So you have to find that, and that's not always easy to do. You spend a lot of time wondering, what do I need to explain? What needs to be explained? And remembering that when someone pulls out their cell phone in our world, they don't stop to think about how it works, and a lot of them have no idea how it works. Lots of people think that when they text message someone, it's going from phone to phone. Oh, look, this photo is now on my phone. This photo has been posted somewhere that theoretically only you and this other person have access to. So,
yeah, that was a staple of bad 1950s science fiction movies. The scientist, and you always knew the scientist because it was always a man, was wearing a white smock, and he would say, "Now, let me explain to you the technology that we all live with and understand, but for some reason, I have to explain to you." It's really bad exposition. And you're right, it does happen. I would take exception to your characterization of fantasy. It's true, we don't have to explain the principles by which Superman flies, but if we want to make a credible world out of a world where Supermen exist, we have to explain at least somehow that they came from Krypton and it had a different sun and our sun gives them power. It doesn't have to be consistent in the way science fiction has to be consistent with real science. But generally speaking, in fantasy, there has to be some consistent world behind the fantasy, you know.
Internal consistency, yes.
People talk all the time, fantasy writers talk about all the time about different magic systems and how magic works. Now, magic doesn't work as far as we know in our real world, but if you want to build a believable fantasy world, you do have to have those. As Eunice says, it has to be internally consistent. Arlene, do you have anything to add to how you go about determining which details, or have I?
No, I've got a lot to say.
Okay, good. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I actually do a workshop on creating the illusion of reality. And part of it is a crash course in perceptual psychology, because Grady is right on the mark. You have to let the characters determine what details you're going to include. They have to experience their world the same way as we do in order to create the illusion of reality. And we don't notice absolutely everything around us. We have what's called a phenomenal field, which contains things that are significant to us at that particular moment in time. So, for example, someone walking out into a garden who has just won the lottery is going to notice everything beautiful about the garden. Someone who walks out into the same garden who has just broken up with their fiance is going to notice ugly things about the garden. They're going to notice different things because their mood is different. The background of the character could determine what is significant to them at a particular time. Even their occupation. You send a carpenter into a room full of wooden furniture, those details are going to matter to the character, how the furniture was constructed, what it's made out of. Those are things that that particular character is going to notice because they're a carpenter. And so to create the illusion of reality, what you've got to do is get inside your character's head and understand what is the character's mood, what has just happened in the story to that character, and what is going to be significant to that character at that point in time. If they're entering a setting for the very first time, they're going to notice a different set of things than if they're going into it for the fifth or sixth time. And that's something else that comes into play. Because, you know, after a few times, you're going to notice things that are out of place. You're going to notice things that are different, but you're not going to notice everything about the room. A lot of what we take in and in sensory stimuli actually goes into our long-term memory. And that's why under hypnosis, people can relax and access their long-term memory and actually remember things that they don't, that they never thought they noticed. Okay, so and that's how I operate in my novels, is I let the characters determine which details are salient, which are significant, and they're the ones that I put in.
So to be clear, your stories tend to focus on characters' point of view as opposed to, say, omniscient narrator narration.
Well,
Because-
the narrator is describing what the characters are seeing
Right.
and what
So-
they're experiencing. So of course it has to be what's significant. What's significant to the story will be what's significant to the characters,
Not necessarily.
and
My
vice versa.
in my novels, I have what I refer to as an unreliable omniscient narrator. So the omniscient narrator is in fact a character in and of itself, right? And that character has its own perceptions and its own ideas about what it wants to say about the story. But in any case, one other thing that I would add kind of in my own, because I developed it a lot in my own writing, and this is specific probably to comedy writers, shut up, thank you. When my approach to world building is that exposition equals death, and the last thing I ever want to do is spend a lot of time describing something. But when I do have to add details in my world that will help the reader understand kind of the action of the story, what's going on, I often resort to comic devices to make it go down a little easier. One of the major ones that I use, and it grew organically out of my own writing, but it's kind of an offshoot. You can see the precedents within Douglas Adams. Douglas Adams, when he wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, he used The Hitchhiker's Guide as a means of info dumping, but info dumping in a way that entertained the reader so that they weren't really aware that they were experiencing world building. Before I wrote narrative fiction, I collected several books full of articles by the Alternate Reality News Service. What they do is they send reporters into other universes, and then they come back and write news articles about what they find there. So it's kind of a science fiction-y, fake newsy kind of thing. And when I started writing particularly novels, yes, Terry Pratchett did the same thing with footnotes. When I started writing novels, I use the Alternate Reality News Service. There are actually articles embedded within the novels. Again, one of the main purposes of which is to help world building. But because I had already developed a comic voice for the Alternate Reality News Service, they also serve as a source of humor. Okay, what should we avoid? We've talked about info dumping. Is there anything else that I'm a huge fan too? Is there something that we should avoid when we're world building? I'll also say that we only have about 20 minutes left. Time really passes. So if anybody has any questions, you should definitely ask them in the chat now. Stephen, I don't think yes, I did start with you. JD, I'll start with you. Anything we should avoid when we build our worlds?
That's tough because, again, so many things are based on the genre, how you're organizing, the kind of story. certainly excessive in the if I don't know how many people here know the Turkey City Lexicon that was developed in the early 70s by a group of mainly science fiction writers to encourage better science fiction writing. And while there are some positives, you should do this. There's quite a lot of it is just things they were sick of seeing. And one of them was, you talked about this earlier, Ira, what they consider the most pernicious form of info dumping. The as you know, Bob dialogue, where people tell each other things that they would obviously know just for the purpose of getting the reader up to speed. And it's like, one, nobody talks like that. Two, you're failing somewhere if they need to tell us these things. There are times when it might work, like if you have a character who genuinely wouldn't understand. But I always come back, I've used this before, I know. I always come back to the movie Arrival, based on a very good Ted Chiang story. There's a moment in the movie that is not in the book where they're talking to Jodie Foster's character about something. And she's a scientist, she's an experienced scientist. And the person interrogating says, well, are you familiar with the principle known as Occam's razor? And she then explains to this group of scientists what Occam's razor is. And then we discuss how it's pertinent to the current event. And I thought, if you had to do that to introduce Occam's razor, something has gone wrong. Because apart from the audience from this movie probably being somewhat scientifically literate, you would never ask somebody who devoted their entire life to science what Occam's razor is. You know, you'd present it. You might say, well, apply Occam's razor, maybe. It just felt like, I know you're doing this for your audience, but at that moment, it was very hard to take those characters seriously because they just wouldn't have that conversation. And it doesn't mean that the whole audience needs to know what that is, but find a better way to say it. So the people who do are not going to be saying, that was dumb. So I think keeping to character, keeping to plausibility, and yes, it's very tricky to know what your reader is going to know or not know. I know, I'll let you move on, but I'll know with the novella I did, Flying Whistle Stop. Yes, there's a kind of info dump flashback to the night the aliens landed, but that's kind of important to the history of this alternate world. And it's also the night the protagonist was born. So those two stories, that very human story, is intertwined with the info dump. And then from then on there, they rarely stop to explain anything. It's just dropped. You'll get a reference. And you go, oh, that's different about the alternate reality. Oh, that's different about, we have a space station in the early 70s. Hendrix is still alive, you know, whatever. They're just referencing the way they would come up in conversation. You know, although the appropriate response is Hendrix is still alive, yay, you know, but you throw those references in and you have to make it seem like the way people interact. And as soon as they're acting like cardboard cutouts, you know, watch the hilariously bad movie Werewolf versus Vampire Women. The entire, apart from being a hilariously bad horror movie, it seems to be set in an alternate reality where everybody speaks in expository dialogue. Moving on.
Okay, we actually have a couple of questions in the chat. Cricket asks, could you use multiple point of views to build on different areas of the world? I think Arlene really touched on that, and that is actually a very good strategy. Eunice has a fascinating question. I'd like to get people's sense of this. You also have to make assumptions about what your readers will know in determining what to share. How do you manage when your world building is based in a culture that isn't the one you think the majority of your readers will be familiar with? Okay, Arlene, go. Yeah, take it.
Put a stranger into that society. Have them discover and ask questions and learn about the society. That's the way I've been doing it all along. So you take someone from our culture, or one that the majority of readers is familiar with, you put them as a fish out of water into this other culture and have them try to navigate within that culture. And as they go along, now it's even better if you give them a sidekick, like a guide, who will explain things to them as they go along. You say, you know, when you reach this point in the city, you're going to have to show these papers and these papers because there's a checkpoint set up over here. Okay, fine. When you meet this individual, do not ever bow. Do not let your head drop below your, and so on. And explaining the mores and the culture and all the rest of it. And that way you are engaging the reader because they will identify with the person who's been dropped into that society. And at the same time, you'll be educating them.
Yeah. The first thing that came into my mind, of course, was Mork and Mindy, for some odd reason. But that's a very kind of common science fiction trope. The sort of literary end of it, which occurred to me, was Brave New World, where the main character is actually an indigenous person who comes to the society of the Brave New World and has to learn everything there is about it. So that's a good way of doing that. Charles asks, when world building for alternate history, how do you handle the alteration exclusion of touchy historical events? I will make one observation about alternate history, and then I'll open it up to everybody else. And that is that, I just came upon this critique recently, but I think it's really important. What happens with a lot of alternate history is that you go back in time and you think of one pivotal moment in history that changes, and then you project into a present that hasn't changed at all except for that one thing. This is really bad world building because, as the critiquer pointed out, when one fundamental aspect of the world changes, everything that follows changes. And so the world that would come out of that one change would be completely different than the one that we're currently living in. That doesn't answer directly your question. So does anybody want to take Stephen? Or is
Yes.
that your hand? Yes, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
This is near and dear to me because in the Bastard Prince saga, Horn of the Kraken and soon the Mistletoe Spear, as well as the adventure modules based on them, I do this alternative history. And what I do, world building alternative, how do you handle it? Okay, you have to look at the dominoes. So, Fimbulwinter started. Consequently, the world was cast into darkness, and the Roman Church heard these legends about this northern realm that was supposed to understand what's going on. Consequently, part of the game system had the church redeploy the Crusaders away from the Middle East to take the north. But also, you have the situation of a simple thing like halls and inns. Inns were not a common thing among the Norse people because the laws of hospitality would have you taken in to the Lord's household, and he would put you up. So there really wasn't a need for inns. But with the resource depletion that came about because of Fimbulwinter, that was no longer being done. So some of the more abandoned halls were retrofitted into inns. So you made practical changes like moving the door from the side of the building to the end of the building so you could put a porch that would stop the, could serve as a gate for paying customers and also give a mudroom area to prevent the cold air from outside coming in as much. So what the whole point is you have to look at that change and realize that the world is a web. And you pull any thread, it affects all the threads around it, and they affect the threads around them. Again, follow the dominoes. And personally, I like to lay in bed and say, okay, if Jarl Eric Bloodaxe wanted to mobilize, this is a better example. If the rivers are all frozen, how are they going to administer themselves? They're going to have to move the capital to the coast. So you move the capital to the coast. Or you have some magical means that the Orse stays open so that Jorvik, which is now York, the capital city of Northumbria, still continues its sea access, because without that, the city dies. So you just have to follow the logic and create a world. Yeah, it's like creating a science fiction world, only you have a start point.
Yeah, I always cite Back to the Future, which I know is a comedy and hugely enjoyable. But if Marty McFly changes fundamentally how his parents meet and court and marry, he still doesn't exist in the future. They would have 3 different children. There's no way they would conceive the same 3 children on the same occasion. But that kind of turns into a downer of an ending, and would not have made all the money that it made. So it gets the comedy wave. Yeah, as far as the original question, I think you look at what changes, but you only really focus on the ones that are relevant to your story, because you're writing a story. You're not writing the alternate history of the world. So references get dropped. I would also note that Elizabeth's question, and the earlier question about the Watson character, the sort of what Arlene was talking about, the character you have to explain things because they're not from that culture. Example of mine and an example of someone else's, the novel The Con. You've got science fiction fans and Jane Austen fans meeting, but the Jane Austen fans don't understand science fiction, and the science fiction fans don't understand Jane Austen. And on top of that, there's a character who doesn't understand or isn't terribly comfortable with either. So there are places to drop explanation. That said, I absolutely admire Avram Davidson and the Masters of the Maze, which admittedly is meant to mess with people's perceptions, for having the gall to introduce one completely different alien species from the perspective of a completely different alien species. But he was deliberately messing with his readers, and you either love that about that book, or you go, what the hell am I reading? And you don't get any further into the maze. It's almost a parody of the trope at that point.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we are just about out of time, so I'm going to go back to the panel one last time. Last thoughts, try and keep it very brief. Grady, last thoughts on world building?
Yeah, I guess about the question we had before going to the chat about like what not to do. I think that, and this is really cliched, but creative writing strategy, but if you can show the reader something rather than tell them, you should always do that. The less you can directly tell, the better. And then the other thing I would say is, if you're ever feeling any form of apathy about what you're writing, you should definitely cut that out of your world. You have to care about everything just as equally for the world to make sense. And yeah, that's my final thought.
Okay, Stephen, final thought?
Okay, final thought. I just want to finish quickly what I was saying before. Some things you just take on head on. The Norse practiced slavery, and this cannot be removed from their culture if you want to do it. But in world building, consistency, internal consistency, and don't violate what we know to be impossible if you're using the same physics as our world.
Okay, Arlene?
Okay, world building is like building an ark. You create a structure, you fill it with living creatures, and you hope to hell it doesn't spring a leak when the important stuff starts.
Thank you. JD, last thoughts?
Last thoughts. Somebody showed me a story draft once, and they insisted, fine, having a sex scene, which was in the back of a particular model sports car. And I wrote, are they dwarves or contortionists to do what you've just described in that location? Believe in the reality of your world and take it seriously, no matter how bizarre your world is. Another version of be consistent, be internally consistent, even if what you're writing about is utterly deranged.
Well, I think it's true of comedians, certainly. The comedians that I admire are all fearlessly dedicated to the humor that they are trying to create. And I think that's actually a really good principle for all artists. You have to be fearless in your pursuit of your creative vision. I would like to thank my panelists. I would like to thank everybody who came here to see our panel. I am going to shamelessly plug the fact that if you want to get a sense of my world building, I am about to read from my latest novel, The Ugly Truth. Stephen, is it at this address? Can I just stay here, or am I going to have to go out and come back in?
You have to go out and come back.
Okay. So anybody who wants to see what I do, hear what I do, come join me. Otherwise, thanks, everybody.
Thanks, gang.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.